All right, can everybody hear me? Excellent. Those in person can hear me. Can we be heard online on Zoom?
Yes, you can. I can hear you well. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for being here this evening. We are going to begin tonight's event. Welcome to the Society in Protest workshop here at the CUNY Graduate Center. We are very excited and honored to be hosting this panel this evening. And let me first start by thanking the Political Science Department for the student-run workshop grant, which has helped make this event possible this evening, as well as by thanking our panelists for joining us and our moderator, Syra, who was instrumental in bringing this together. For those who might be new to our workshop, we here aim to foster an open and intellectual community where scholars, activists, policymakers, theorists, and more come together to think through social movements in political context, the local context, and the historical ground on which they take place. On the 16th of September, 2022, a 22-year-old Iranian woman was killed by police after being arrested by the guidance patrol, sometimes called the morality police, for improper wearing of hijab, a violation of compulsory hijab laws. The young woman was identified by media as Mahsa Amini. She had just recently been admitted to university to study law and become a lawyer. However, the name identified in media was not the name known and used by her and those who knew her, family, her friends, her social world. There she was Gina Amini, a Kurdish woman. Under the Islamic Republic regime, use of Kurdish names is repressed, as are the rights of Kurdish and other minority groups, as well as women. At her funeral, Gina's mother declared that her name may become a symbol. And in the massive protests and uprising that has emerged in the wake of her death, it has become one, as a diverse social movement of Iranians has united around the name of Gina Amini and taken up the Kurdish freedom cry, Jan Jian Azagi, woman, life, freedom. This has led many to hope that for Iranians, a revolution may be in the making. And with that, we will turn it over to Syra, who's a PhD student in political science studying political theory at the CUNY Graduate Center.
Can you hear me? Like, I don't
Speaking to the audience.
Okay. I would like to thank everyone for being here, the panelists and also the audience. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to kind of lay the ground how the situation is in Iran and like why we are having this discussion. There's something mesmerizing in the serene joy of women dancing on the streets in Iran, about the determined look in their faces as they hold up their scarves or tie their hair, about the chant, woman, life, freedom. At a moment when the old is dead on a global level and the new cannot be born, and in the context of one of the most brutal regimes, this revolution of tears and kisses, as one song puts it, gives rise to the imagination of a life worth living. The spectacle of women's bravery became a symbol of defiance and a call for dignified life for all. Revolutions cannot and should not be reduced to spectacles, though. The moments of collective effervescence are transitory, and the result could be no more than the eternal recurrence of the same, as Iran's contemporary history testifies. More recently, the spectacular images of Tahrir Square or the streets of Tunisia fell short of transforming the oppressive order. As Asaf Fayyad points out in Revolution Without Revolutionaries, despite overthrowing the existing regimes, Arab revolution lacked revolutionary imagination and the radicalism in political and economic outlook necessary for creating structural change. The revolutionary fervor could also be appropriated and abused by groups and figures who having financial and organizational resources, managed to exclude other groups and consolidate power. This lesson Iran learned the hard way. Attempts at appropriation of the current revolutionary movement are already ongoing. With an ominous sense of deja vu, one of the most reactionary groups among the Iranian opposition has more financial resources and receives the most coverage in Western media. The salaried expat opposition is incapable of noticing the irony between meetings with misogynist figures such as Jordan Peterson, Mike Pompeo, and well-known anti-abortion activists, and the chance of woman life freedom on the streets in Iran. The best this opposition has come up with is the call for solidarity and unity around the son of the deposed Shah, whose alleged record of political activities and disinterestedness is supposed to make him an ideal option for leadership of the opposition. Go figure. Given the intensity of people's dissatisfaction with the existing regime, one could argue that the absence of a viable alternative is one of the reasons that the Islamic Republic has been capable of maintaining power. The government, of course, relies on brutal force, but given the extreme internal divisions and the intensity of the crises, it is not clear how much longer suppression could keep it in power. The first step to understand Iran's political scene is to recognize that today the dichotomy of reformist conservative explains nothing, as they both played a major role in neoliberalization of the economy, in the social and cultural spheres, where the reformists were supposed to represent a more liberal outlook. Their concessions have not convinced the regime's core to allow them a share in power, but were enough to erode people's trust. The more principled actors among reformists, mostly in prison or under house arrest, have already called for transition of power and a new constitution. The category of conservatives also fails to capture the ruling class, which is far from unified. The acceleration of privatizations in the past 15 years has led to the formation of racketeering groups with contrasting interests. The public gets a sense of these fierce but hidden rivalries through disqualifications for elections, trials, open slanders, and even murders. The current stalemate in the Islamic Republic is to some extent due to the inability of any of these rivals to dominate the scene. In conditions that the ruling power allows no independent political activity, and while the old and new parties in exile lack any meaningful tie with the Iranian society, labor and teachers' unions, retiree centers, syndicates, and students and professional associations are the only organizations that can have legitimate claim to representativeness. Some of these organizations, along with feminist websites, have published a charter that enlists minimum demand from the post-Islamic Republic system, including gender equality, rights of LGBTQ community, absolute freedom of speech and association, work safety, unemployment benefits, and a strong social welfare system, elimination of patriarchal structures, putting an end to the destruction of environment, ban on criminalization of political activity, execution, and any form of torture, ban on child labor, and on all forms of religious, gender, ethnic, and national discriminations. Despite the charter's crudeness, it is one of the most progressive documents in contemporary Iranian politics. This panel was organized in honor of these groups. It aspires to initiate conversations about potential modes of transition in which these voices would not be silenced. Now I'm really excited to introduce our panelists. First, we have Professor Janet Afary, she holds the Meli Camp Chair in Global Religion and Modernity at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she is a professor of religious studies. Her award-winning books include Sexual Politics in Modern Iran, The Iranian Constitutional Revolution, Grassroots Democracy, Social Democracy, and the Origins of Feminism. With Kevin Anderson, she has co-written Foucault and the Iranian Revolution, Gender and the Seduction of Islamism. And more recently, with Kamran Afary, she has written Mullah Nasruddin, The Making of a Modern Trickster. We also have Bahareh Ebne Alian, who is going to be Dr. Ebne Alian in 2 weeks. She is a student at NSSR, New School for Social Research, and she has written her dissertation under the supervision of Andrew Arato this year. Saeed Rahnema is award-winning retired professor of political science and public policy at York University, Canada. He has served as director of York School of Public Policy and Administration and a director of Middle East Economic Association. In his homeland, Iran, he was a senior member of the Industrial Management Institute in Tehran. During the Iranian Revolution of 1979, he was a leading activist in the Left and Workers' Council's movement. His recent works in English include The Transition from Capitalism, Marxist Perspectives, Neoliberal Imperialism, The Latest Stage of Capitalism, Radical Social Democracy, A Phase of Transition to Democratic Socialism, Alternative Economic Systems, and Lessons of the Second Revolution, and in Socialism and Democracy. Yeah, I hope I was reading this correctly. And then we have Andrew Arato here, who was born in Hungary in 1944. He has been in the US since 1957. He got his PhD from University of Chicago and has been teaching at the New School since 1976. In 1982, he became a full-time professor, and now he is Dorothy Hirschen Professor at the New School for Social Research. He has written many books, including Civil Society and Political Theory, Constitution Making Under Occupation, Post-Sovereign Constitution Making, The Adventures of the Constituent Power, and Populism and Civil Society. Now I would like to just give the floor to Professor Afary for her talk. I'm sorry, we are going to listen from Professor Afary and Bahareh, and we'll have a 15 minutes break, and then we can come back and have the rest of the time.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Should I share screen and start?
Sure.
Okay. All right. Okay, very nice to meet everyone remotely. I'm very sorry I couldn't be there. Would have really liked to be able to come actually, but they're just keeping us really busy at school. I was actually very pleased to get this invitation. I haven't been asked to talk about the Constitutional Revolution for quite some time. And I'm particularly happy because what Sarah said, because it seems in all the debates about the reformists and the monarchists, people seem to forget that Iran really has a very rich history of constitutional politics, certainly two periods, not very long periods, but very, very important periods. I'm just going to limit myself to the first constitutional era, which is the 1906 period, but maybe in the discussion, we can also talk about the Mossadegh period, okay? All right, so at the turn of the 20th century, we witnessed the eruption of several major revolutions in the non-European world, such as Iran, India, Turkey, and China. And contrary to common assumptions, these revolutions were not challenging the imperialist interventions of the West alone, but they were also calling for more democratic social and political orders at home. Most of them were following the example of the 1905 Russian Revolution and aspired to having a constitution and a parliamentary system that checked the powers of the monarch and the clerical establishment. In cities such as Baku and Tbilisi in South Caucasus, then part of Tsarist Russia, which was home to large populations of Shia Muslims of Iranian heritage, we see individuals and intellectuals who had maintained their close ties to their ancestral homeland and become very important to Iran in its revolution. In 1905, in the South Caucasus, they had formed their own secret social democratic cells, known as the Ijtemaiyun Amiyun. They upheld liberalism and nationalism, called for political and social reforms. They demanded distribution of land to peasants, reforms in child labor, modern education for boys and girls, an 8-hour day, and other similar social democratic reforms. Their program suggests that one could be a devout Muslim and a social democrat. So they also criticized the extreme authority of the Shi'i clerics and demanded an end to certain practices such as self-flagellation and Shi'i rituals. These movements in the north had a dramatic influence on Iran, which had its own revolution in 1906, known as the Constitutional Revolution. Began with well, actually, I should say it really culminated in 14,000 guild members having a sit-in at the garden of the British legation in the summer of 1906. And initially, they were just demanding a house of justice, if you will. Those who participated were members of what we call the modern intelligentsia. Many of them had studied or traveled in Europe or had held positions as diplomats. They also had impeccable political connections. Among them, we see, for example, the son-in-law of the reigning king, Muzaffar ad-Din Shah, and also the two sons of his prime minister. In August of 1906, Muzaffar ad-Din Shah signed an unprecedented royal proclamation that allowed the formation of a national parliament known as Majlis and the drafting of a constitution. The model for the Iranian constitution was the Belgian constitution of 1831, but the Iranians also borrowed elements from the Bulgarian and Ottoman laws. Popular elections were soon held. The Majlis opened in 1906. A limited male franchise for men with some property was established. As elsewhere, property and language qualifications barred peasants, workers, and many non-Persian speaking tribes and communities. Still, this relatively clean election and the contribution of liberal and social democratic deputies made the first Iranian parliament one of the most respected institutions of modern Iran. Following the death of Muzaffar ad-Din Shah in early January of 1907, his son Muhammad Ali Shah ascended to the throne. The revolution now entered the more perilous stage. The new Shah detested the limits placed on his powers, recognized that the easy way to challenge the new order was to claim that it was anti-Islam. The Shah was backed by conservative clerics, especially Sheikh Fazlullah Nouri, the most important cleric of Tehran, who also realized that the new constitution undermined the vast authority of the clerical establishment. In their fight against the new monarch and conservative clerics, constitutionalists relied on three sources. They had the support of three more progressive grand clerics in Najaf, then part of the Ottoman Empire, the numerous grassroots institutions of the revolution known as Anjumans. In Tehran alone, there were like 200 of these and elsewhere. And then finally, the newspapers. There are about 200 newspapers from this period, including many radical left of center newspapers. Together, the Anjumans and the newspapers introduced an unprecedented discourse about the limits on the powers of the Shah and the clerics, freedom of press and organization, democratic rights of urban and rural communities, certain peasants' rights, and urban women's rights to education and association. The first Majlis accomplished a number of unprecedented deeds during its short-lived existence. It ratified a modern and liberal constitution, which drastically reduced the powers of the king, set up three branches of government, executive, legislative, and judiciary. It has substantially reduced the authority of the king. He remained head of the state, but his ministers answered to parliament and could be dismissed by the decision of parliament. Parliament also had the right to ratify all major financial transactions, including foreign transactions. It created new secular laws and judicial codes that reduced the powers of clerics and decreed that parliamentary meetings were open to the public and also published the Majlis proceedings in newspapers. Until then, Iran was ruled by two sets of laws. Sharia religious law, which was controlled by the Shi'i ulama, and Urf customary law, which is administered by the state. Liberal and social democratic deputies such as Hassan Taqiyzadeh and journalists such as Ali Akbar Khuda hoped to replace this binary legal system with a more modern and secular legal system. In winter of 1907, progressive parliamentarians proposed a Bill of Rights that codified some of the civil liberties that had been gained in the course of the revolution with the help of the radical Anjumans and the progressive newspapers. But the process of ratifying this document turned into a major political and ideological confrontation with the king and the clerics. The final draft, which is known as the Supplementary Constitutional Law, was ratified in October 1907. It guaranteed certain basic rights for citizens, the right to form association. The Anjumans gained a lot of rights, for example, the right to collect taxes, as well as citizens gained the right equality before the law for all male citizens. However, the same document ended up institutionalizing the powers of the clerics in the Constitution. So the question then becomes, how did this happen? The Royal Proclamation, the electoral laws, the Constitution of 1906 had all been largely secular documents, making brief references to the Quran when an oath was required. With the new Bill of Rights, however, constitutionalists had attempted to further this process. They wanted to curtail the domain of the Sharia in major ways. And instead, they were forced to grant the clerics much more institutional authority within the Majlis. To Article 1, here I have it, the official religion of Iran is Islam, according to the Orthodox Afary doctrine of 12 or Shiism, and also the fact that the Shah is expected to profess and promote the Shii Afary doctrine. So therefore emphasizing the religious underpinnings and obligations. And I've looked at the earlier drafts of this constitutional as a supplement, and there wasn't anything like that there. It was all about the Iranian nation. And then Article 2 ended up calling for the establishment of a council of clerics with veto power over the parliament, and stated that laws ratified by parliament could not be at variance with the Sharia. The architect of this law was the ranking Mujtahid Nouri. In the summer of 1906, Nouri had briefly supported the constitutionalists, but very quickly turned against it, joined the new king, issued fatwas, and wrote articles in his new newspaper, Lavoye Sheikh Fazlullah Nouri, where he accused the supporters of the movements of heresy and apostasy. He was an early advocate of a concept that we know as Vilayat al-Faqih, rule by jurists, which later, of course, in the 1970s, Ayatollah Khomeini famously advocated. This is a stamp commemoration of Nouri in the Islamic Republic, by the way. However, I should say Nouri's view of rule by jurists was far more limited than that of Ayatollah Khomeini, because Nouri had never opposed the institution of monarchy. Now, Article 2 was a novelty in the history of constitutionalism, both in Europe and the Middle East. Neither the Ottoman nor the Bulgarian laws had given overt recognition and power to the religious establishment. The Sunni Ottomans had a much more extensive history of reform than the Iranians, where the Sultan had claimed the authority of the Caliph, supreme leader, since the 15th century. The Tanzimat reforms of the mid-19th century had recognized the nominal equality of the multi-ethnic Ottoman subjects before the law without distinction of class and religion. Article 11 of the Ottoman Constitution did make Islam state religion, but it did not give preference to Sunni Muslims. Furthermore, this Ottoman article contained a provision for the protection of religious minorities, saying that the law would protect the free exercise of faith professed in the empire. So why did this happen in Iran? In other words, why did we end up with something like Article 2 in the Constitution of Iran? There are lots of reasons for this. First of all, there are major doctrinal differences between Sunnism and Shiism, giving Shii clerics who claim to be descendants of the Prophet and representatives of the Imam, hidden Imam on earth, much greater authority. Also, rules of purification are far more extensive in Shiism than in Sunnism. In Sunni denominations, impurity is not attributed to a person. In other words, a Christian is not impure per se. Contamination by blood, semen, etc., can make a person impure. But in Shiism, impurity is attributed to the whole person, which means that social hierarchies were far more entrenched, and also with regard to gender, far stricter, which we all, of course, attribute to Zoroastrianism as the foundation for these. In addition, Shii clerics historically were given greater rights by the rulers since the 16th century establishment of the Safavid dynasty compared to their Sunni brethren in the Ottoman Empire. Shia ulama were also financially independent from the monarchy because they collected substantial annual tax. And clerics also had played an influential role in the early stages of the constitutional revolution. So for all of these reasons, they end up being far more powerful. Can someone close down a microphone that makes all that noise, please? Thank you. As would happen throughout modern Iranian history, parliament was unable to take the Shah, the ulama clerics, at the same time while it was also fighting the encroachment of the powerful imperialist power here, Russia and Britain. When Great Britain and Russia signed the 1907 treaty in St. Petersburg, partitioning the country in the northern Russian and southern British zone, they further weakened the constitutionalists who found themselves with their back to the wall. Three leading clerics known as sources of emulation in Najaf by the names of Mazandarani, Khorasani, and Hussein Tehrani supported the constitutionalists. As I said earlier, Najaf, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, in that empire, clerics had accepted the Tanzimat, religious and social reforms, which had culminated in the short-lived Ottoman constitution. And so Najaf ulama agreed that to save Iran from foreign concessions, debts, and other irresponsible actions of the monarchy, parliament was needed, and greater limits had to be placed on the Shah and his court. However, even these constitutionalist clerics envisioned a much more prominent role for the Sharia and the jurists in the new order that the constitutionalists wanted. When Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri and his supporters rejected the first draft of the supplementary law for its secular orientation and accused liberal constitutionalists of heresy and apostasy, the Majlis then ended up agreeing to the formation of a clerical council. In this clerical council, the responsibility was to compare and contrast the new laws with the Sharia and amend undesirable and overly secular ones. And so the result becomes Article 2 of the Constitution. Now, clerics who backed the Constitution and those who opposed it actually agreed on a number of issues. They both supported Article 2 of the supplementary law that held that Majlis should be prevented from drafting laws that conflicted with the Sharia. They both insisted that the ranking jurist should control the judicial branches of government. And finally, they both expected that existing social hierarchies between Muslims and non-Muslims, Shias and Sunnis, men and women would remain intact. Although some clerics grudgingly agreed to the representation of non-Muslim representatives in the parliament, most assumed that the new constitution left Sharia law intact and simply codified and expanded Urf law. Now, Nuri's position is very clear. Equality and Islam, he says, may never coexist. The Sharia clearly separated, he says, the rights of a slave and a free man, a father and a son, a husband and a wife, a wealthy and a poor man, a wise and a fool. The Sharia had also distinguished between a Muslim and an apostate, a Zimmi, this is a non-Muslim, a religious minority apostate, a captive apostate, and those who left Islam. And so those who called for ratification of these civil rights, he called them base and dishonorable people. He said the Sharia had given Muslim men special privileges over others, and yet these constitutionalists wanted to deny themselves these advantages. So going on to say, may God curse those who do not value themselves and want to be equal and brother with the Zoroastrian, the Armenian, and the Jew. The Najaf ulama, who supported the constitutional revolution, aired their views to distinguished students. And I don't have the time to go over the details of their work, but primarily what we hear from them, this is one of the most famous ones of his students, is author of a book in this period. And he basically makes this argument that equality is not going to mean equal rights for non-Muslims or for women. In other words, don't worry about this. This is not going to happen in Iran, basically. Or even on unveiling of women, for example, he says. These radical measures are not going to be adopted. The Constitution is not calling, he says, for equality between adults and children, sane and insane people, healthy and sick people, and so forth. And so with these assurances, he convinces other clerics that the new constitutional order with the new supplements would not interfere with the ulama's authority in any significant form or other. And so with their aid, these Najaf clerics and their supporters in Tehran, they're able to ratify Article 8, which gives equality before the law to Iranian citizens. It actually says the people of the Persian Empire are to enjoy equal rights before state law. And the key here is the concept of before state law. So as far as the clerics were concerned, religious and therefore legal distinction between Muslims and non-Muslims still existed in Iran. Now, there are other civil rights that are ratified as long as they are not trampling on the rights of the clerics, for example. So you have extensive rights given to these Anjumans. They organize themselves, they can supervise any necessary reforms, they can collect taxes, they can set up a local budget. You have other civil rights that guarantee individual property rights, sanctity of life and domicile, privacy with regard to letters and telegrams, trials, rights of citizens not to be exiled, and so forth. In addition, the state, rather than the clergy, was put in charge of the public educational system. And this, I should say, was a major achievement for the constitutionalists. However, further concessions had to be made in education, in freedom of press and association. So throughout you have, freedom of press is guaranteed so long as it is not productive of mischief or religious mischief or something like that, or save in conditions where it's maybe forbidden by ecclesiastical law. So, and then they go one by one through these articles and they sort of tack it at the very end of that. Certain progressive clauses of the Belgian and Ottoman constitution, as well as the Bulgarian ones, never made it to the Iranian law. So Article 14 to 16 of Belgian constitution established freedom of religion. That was not granted and was not included. A Belgian constitution recognized people's multilingual heritage. Iran was also a multilingual nation, but they didn't include that. Ottoman constitution had prohibited corvée labor, but they wouldn't include that. Ottoman constitution had banned torture and inquisition, but the Iranians didn't include that. Article 61 of the Bulgarian constitution had banned slavery, but they didn't include that. So none of these civil rights made it into the Iranian law. But constitutionalists did push for eradication of the last vestiges of slavery and the slave trade in Iran in other ways. Now, certain progressive, in fact, the whole question of liberty now becomes a pejorative. Personal freedoms are either absent or restricted in much of the Iranian constitution. Many clerics continue to oppose the concept of individual freedom, azadi, and the word soon took on a highly pejorative connotation. In some quarters, the term azadi, including the right to be different and to act differently from other people, was equated with irreligion, immorality, lack of chastity, and licentiousness. In terms of gender and women's rights, azadi came to have a doubly negative connotation and was directly associated with sexual immorality. A free woman, Zana Azad, became an immoral and sexually promiscuous one. As a result, we see at least three basic public positions on the proposed civil rights. The conservative clerics saying secular civil code was irreconcilable with the Sharia. The moderate clerics saying domain of civil and religious law would forever remain separate. So they accept equality with the understanding that these are going to remain separate, but never liberty. And finally, the more secular and left-wing members of parliament who publicly deny that there may be any contradictions between the proposed civil liberties of equality and liberty and the Sharia law. And how do we know that? We know them basically through letters they were writing to each other at the time. So in conclusion, the Iranian constitutional laws of 1906-07 went far beyond the Belgian, Bulgarian, Ottoman constitutions, as well as those of Germany, Japan, and Russia, introducing monarchical powers. The Majlis is a legislative body vested with many of the rights that had previously been the province of European or Japanese monarchs. And I did a pretty clear, close reading of it to make sure that, in fact, it really was more progressive than these other laws they had consulted. The Constitution established the principle of national sovereignty. The Shah was a representative of the people, stating very clearly that all the power emanates from the nation. The Constitution guaranteed basic civil rights and curtailed the vast authority of the Shah by mandating regular consultation with his ministers and cabinet and members of parliament also. Clerical authority was restricted in three major ways: by creating a new legislative body, by dividing the judiciary into religious and secular units, where the clerics ended up controlling the religious and family law. This is not what they wanted to do. They had one judiciary, but eventually they gave in. They said, that's the only way we can do it. By establishing the principle that the state and not the clerics were able to control the educational system, I would say that that's another really important way in which they curtailed the powers of the clerics. The 1907 law granted equal state rights to Sunni Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, but neither Babis or Baha'is without mentioning them. Here, the language of the law was less precise and transparent than those of the Belgian, Bulgarian, or Ottoman laws. In 1911, universal male suffrage was adopted, but women's suffrage had to wait another 50 years in 1963. The supplementary laws of 1907 also gave a council of clerics substantial powers and privileges that directly violated the earlier spirit of the Constitution. National identity was now subsumed under religious identity. And I just want to emphasize that this was really a very important issue to the constitutionalists, which they had fought and they lost eventually. The ulama gained veto power over the Majlis. Some of the civil liberties of the 1906 Constitution, freedom of press, were somewhat more curtailed by 1907. Other civil liberties were restricted with religious qualifications. The Council of Clerics briefly functioned during the second Majlis, but in future decades, in future Majlises, secular constitutionalists made the argument that there were enough high-ranking clerics in the Majlis so that they didn't need to form a council of clerics. So it was there on paper, but it didn't really function in that sense. And yet the very existence of Article 2 robbed the process of its very original liberal spirit. Now, the memory of the democratic revolution has remained with the Iranians and has been continuously revived. Of course, the very best example is the period of Mossadegh in the 1951 to 53. Parliament remained and was never outlawed. New modern laws were constantly introduced. Industrialization, modernization, urbanization, all constitutional goals were accelerated. Education and health reforms all continued for the next century. However, the clerical battle with constitutionalism against the more democratic Iranian society also continued. Finally, in a 1959 essay, historian Lawrence Lockhart perceptively predicted that the possibility exists, he says, remains, that the Council of Clerics might someday be brought back into existence when it might challenge the legality of any legislation passed while it was in abeyance. So he says it's in 1959. This became, of course, Ayatollah Khomeini's argument, a little bit in the 1940s, but then very full in 1970s. Khomeini moved beyond all other clerics, proposing a maximalist reading of the notion of rule of jurist, Vilayat Faqih. He claimed absolute powers for the Faqih and argued that in the absence of the hidden imam, a Faqih should rule the nation outright, determining all laws, thereby also assuming the powers of the Shah, a process which some scholars have called the Sunnification of Shiism in a theocratic state. Thank you very much. Thanks. We have a singing person here. Sounds interesting.
Okay. Thank you so much. I just realized that I forgot to mention the name of the talk. So now Bahareh and Alian is going to talk about a requiem for the dreams of 1979, how a revolution could go so wrong.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everyone. Let me just start by saying that I've learned from everyone on this panel. I've read their work, and it's quite an honor to be presenting with you. Also a little bit intimidating, but get that under control. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the second Iranian revolution of the 20th century, the 1979 revolution. And I'm going to start with a couple of misconceptions, I believe, about the revolution. First, that the 79 revolution is this unique, mysterious, aberrant revolution that somehow defies any sort of explanation that has been used for other modern revolutions. Part of the reason being that you have this mixture of quite incompatible elements in this revolution. You have revolution as this modern form of emancipatory form of collective action on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have this group of whatever you want to call them, reactionary, traditional, fundamentalist religious forces. So how could you really have a revolution, with these contradictory elements? Another related misconception about the revolution is that the authoritarian outcome of the revolution was somehow preordained, that basically because of the role of political Islam as the mobilizing ideology of the revolutionary forces, and also Ayatollah Khomeini's charismatic hold on the masses, that the outcome of the revolution was somehow this authoritarian theocracy was inevitable. So against these ideas, I'm going to argue that the Iranian Revolution and its outcome is neither unique, nor was it inevitable. And I'm also going to argue that the primary factor behind the outcome and the tragedy of the revolution was not really Islam, political Islam as the ideology, or the religious identity of the revolutionary forces. To begin with, the revolution was really the work of a wide coalition of forces. Up until 1978, it was really secular intellectuals, it was nationalists in the National Front, liberals of the liberation movement, and several leftist groups that had led the opposition movement. It was in 1979, really, that suddenly you have Islamists around Khomeini gaining momentum, but they were latecomers to the scenes in a certain sense. And their eventual victory after the revolution took everyone by surprise, including Khomeini and Islamist, follower. Second, as much as Khomeini's charisma, was there, and it's not doubted, but before the revolution and even shortly after the revolution, in numerous, I cannot emphasize, speeches, interviews, he emphasized consistently that he does not want any office for either himself or for the clergy. And just to remember, at the time of the revolution, he's almost 80 years old. He has lived in exile for over 15 years, and he has absolutely no background in politics, no party, no, former office, nothing. And also his theory of velayat faqih, the mandate of the jurist, as the leadership principle was, for the most part, besides certain circles, unknown in Iran at the time. And lastly, the third point, and probably the most important one, is that the revolution somehow started with a preliminary draft constitution that was completed pretty much by January 1979 and received the approval, the consensus of almost all forces involved in the revolution, including Khomeini himself several times. I'm going to talk about this later, but just to put these three together, these three elements, the plurality of forces who were involved, and the fact that Khomeini had denied any position for himself, and also the existence of this preliminary draft, we can see that the outcome was perhaps not as preordained, and yet still the revolution ended with this very tragic outcome of replacing one dictatorship with another. As Saeed Rahnema puts it, just replacing basically the turban for the crown. So the question is how? How did that come about? I don't think anyone would doubt that the really existing Islamic Republic today is not what the 1979 revolutionaries really hoped to achieve, including many of the revolutionaries who supported Khomeini. I do not believe that this was the idea. So what I suggest is that if we shift the focus from the identity of the victorious camp to rather the mode of the political transition, the revolutionary mode of regime change, and the sovereign mode of constitution making that followed it, I think we can make sense of the Iranian Revolution in a way that wouldn't cast it as this really bizarre, exceptional revolution that does not follow anything else that we know. By the revolutionary mode of transformation, what I have in mind is the total, absolute legal rupture that followed the revolution, the institutional collapse and the political void, basically, that was opened up with the fall of the monarchy. I think if we instead focus on this mode of transition and also on the mode of constitution making, then we can see that the Iranian case is just another example, basically, in the long line of temporary revolutionary dictatorships that were, turned permanent through the usurpation of the constituent power by one of the groups among the revolutionary forces, which is not something unique to the Iranian case. It's generally good to remember that revolutions, even when they are very popular, for example, if we accept that the Iranian Revolution of '79 was the most popular modern revolution, they are still far from the work of majorities. There were 11% of the population involved in the revolution. And the unity of forces in the beginning phase of the revolution against the outgoing regime was, of course, replaced by the very diversity and plurality of outlooks, interests, visions for the new regime. In the rest of what I have, I'm going to talk about what happened from basically February 1979 to the end of November or beginning of December 1979. Everything basically happens during this 10 months period, but I'm going to talk about this period in two separate phases. The first is basically the phase from February to April. The second one is from April to early December. What characterizes the first phase really is, well, for one thing, it's the replacement of the dual sovereignty that is the marker of the revolutionary situation with a situation of dual power in Trotsky's formulation. What I mean by that is that you do have an official provisional government in place, but at the same time, you have a shadow state of informal bodies that I'm going to talk a little bit about. But before getting to that, what's really important here about the revolutionary break is that all of the attempts to have a more orderly staged transition, somehow arriving at an understanding with the last prime minister of Shah, Bakhtiyar, who himself was one of the opposition, was a member of National Front. All of those attempts failed. Instead, what you have is basically the Shah leaves Iran and this seat of sovereignty is opened up, and you have Khomeini who steps in and claims sovereignty, claims sovereign power. At this point, temporarily, again, remembering the formally he is a nobody, like, he does not have any position, any party. But perhaps partly because he seems so out of all of this, because, there doesn't seem to, for him to have any force in the race, so to speak, he's kind of capable of securing the place that he did for himself. What happens here from the very beginning is that Khomeini first appoints a revolutionary council, which is supposed to be this temporary body as a legislature. Important about this body, this revolutionary council, is that the composition of the body basically remains a secret for the duration of its operation. It's not publicly known who are the members of this body. If you look at the newspapers from the time, most of the guesses that you hear from the people is that this is a revolutionary council manned by members of National Front, Liberation Movement, so the mostly secular democratic forces. But the council, originally all 5 members who are appointed by Khomeini, are clergy, and clergy for the duration of the council, after all of the changes, always maintain their majority. Another thing to keep in mind about this body is that it's basically under no limit whatsoever. Like in that sense, it's a sovereign body that can decide whatever law rule they want to establish without any constitution or any other thing setting limits on. On the other hand, you have provisional government of Bahareh, who is a liberal. Provisional government is appointed by Khomeini with the recommendation of the Revolutionary Council. Already what you see from this picture is that you have completely excluded the leftist forces from the scene. Like, you have a sort of a coalition of Islamists and secular liberals, but no leftists. Another thing that I think is very important about this phase is, and about this revolutionary mode of transition, is that any sort of procedural concern is completely dismissed. Bahareh is appointed prime minister, and his government is declared to be the government of the hidden imam. But, well, who gave Khomeini to appoint this body? Khomeini, was constantly talking about how the Shah's regime was illegal. But throughout all of these criticism, that mostly from the leftist groups, but also some of the secular nationalist liberals coming up, that what about inclusivity, what about transparency, what about representativeness of such a body with absolute power? The answer of Khomeini is always basically a direct reference to the people. So people would come to the street, and through their demonstration, they would show their support for Bahareh and his government. So there is no procedural understanding of the process of the democracy or the process of establishing a new order. Another thing, which would be one of the last things, I guess I hope to mention about this first phase until April, is that, as I said in the beginning, sure, Khomeini was charismatic to his supporters, but originally he did not have any organizational basis for his support. He didn't have a church, he didn't have a party, but that temporary position that, after the revolutionary break is opened up and he can occupy, is basically all he needs to erect within just one short month everything that basically constitutes a state, a shadow state. In the Revolutionary Council, he has his unlimited legislature, not just in the provisional government, which was not completely aligned with Khomeini, but in comites, which are these committees, organic grassroots bodies. He eventually finds an executive body for himself, revolutionary courts, and their mullah judges who are appointed by Khomeini become his judiciary. He establishes, all of this, when I say he, I'm also including the Revolutionary Council, which is his legislative arm. He gets an independent army parallel to the Artesh, the ordinary army in the Revolutionary Guard. He gets a complete monopoly over media. And eventually he also gets a party. I mean, it seems that he's still standing out of it, but his supporters, mostly those in the Revolutionary Council, established the Islamic Republic Party that soon basically, we'll see how it took over the whole process of constitution making. So on the one side, in this first phase of this plurality or multiplicity of power centers, you have the provisional liberal government on the one side, and you have Khomeini and the other forces on the other. And from very much from the very beginning, you start seeing the clashes between these two sides. The revolutionary dictatorship of Khomeini and all these forces with the constant interventions is somehow tolerated, thinking that it's temporary, and we got that preliminary draft that we have all agreed on. So this is just a chaotic, exceptional revolutionary situation. And once it's over, we are not going to have any more of this mullah basically constantly telling the government what to do. But that temporary position was basically enough to place Khomeini and his supporters in a place to, from then on, set the rules of the games, right? So they are no longer just one participant in the whole struggle, one of the contenders, but they set the rules of the game for all of the others. The first manifestation of this comes at the end of March. Everything I talk about in 1979, so if I don't mention it, just assume it's 1979. At the end of March, there is this early referendum that Khomeini and his supporters pushed through. It's quite a meaningless referendum. The referendum is basically voting yes or no to the transition from monarchy to an Islamic Republic regime, the constitution of which the people would see, later and discuss later. It's meaningless because the monarchy is already overthrown and nobody knows what is Islamic Republic. What the provisional government comes out and basically tells people is that, well, we are going to be a republic. The majority of people are Muslim in this country, so it's going to be an Islamic Republic. It doesn't mean that, it's going to be a theocracy. The referendum, naturally comes out with a very high turnout for Islamic Republic. Almost 98% of all the eligible voters come to the polls, and of those, about 99% vote yes. How much of that can be trusted or not is another issue, but definitely this becomes a turning point in the sense that this is the moment that revolution is rebranded as Islamic revolution. Before that, nobody is referring to the revolution really as the Islamic revolution. But throughout all of these clashes between the different sides and different ideas, you have the draft constitution as a glue, still keeping all of these forces together. That changes when we get to the second phase of the revolution from April to end of November. This is where we have the process of constitution making really during this phase. Originally, the plan when the provisional government was appointed, the provisional government was tasked with eventually forming a constituent assembly that would, go over the preliminary draft and finalize the process. But already by April, through all of the struggle and all of the oppositions that the other forces had about the referendum, you see that this atmosphere, this post-revolutionary atmosphere, that you do not have an established power, you do not really have the kind of order that you can count on. There are constant, if not real, but at least fan-sized threat of conspiracy or something happening. So you hear for the first time some talks that who needs a whole constituent assembly with 600, 700 representatives? The election to such an assembly is going to take so long, and that the deliberation of such assembly will take even longer. We don't have those kind of, that kind of time. So instead of that, Khomeini wants to put the preliminary draft constitution directly on a referendum, on a second referendum for the people to directly decide whether they would adopt that or not. I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but the draft is a pretty secular democratic draft. There is no mention of Velayat Faqih mandate of the jurist, and the only position that is reserved for Muslim jurists is in the Guardian Council. As Professor Afary was saying, it's kind of a continuation, although in the draft, even the Guardian Council, which was in charge of making sure that the legislations of parliament are not contrary to Islam, even in that body, in the draft, the Muslim jurists did not have the majority, they were in a minority. It did not have an automatic reviewing of legislation. It would only, enter if a few authorities asked it to do so. So anyway, it is one of those cunnings of history that it's the liberals who insist that, no, we have promised people that we are going to have a constituent assembly, we are going to have a full body to come and voice their opinions. So at the end, between Khomeini's idea of putting that draft on a direct referendum and between this idea of a big constituent assembly, a compromise is made, which is the worst of all possible options. The compromise is that instead of either taking it to a referendum or to a big assembly, we are going to have what is called an experts assembly. So a smaller assembly that is going to, at first, only be 40, but eventually they decide on 73 members, that they would come and they are only given 1 month time, basically to only review the draft and to finalize it. What we get from the private conversation actually is that the problem wasn't so much with the fear of instability of a revolutionary government or the fear of taking time, but really at the time the fear, because different forces, the differences at this point have become quite manifest. Khomeini is very much scared of the same thing that happened in the first Iranian revolution happening again, basically meaning that Muslim jurists being sidelined and the draft constitution losing even those few religious elements that it had. And he's very much scared of lawyers basically becoming the majority if a constituent assembly is formed and they changing the draft even in more secular directions. So the idea of having this smaller experts assembly is decided in this general atmosphere of distrust when even the draft constitution that has received the agreements of all forces does not have any enforcement mechanism behind. So every force is really scared of exclusion should another force gain the majority in the assembly for writing the constitution. It's a compromise, and still the draft itself is not under attack. So the whole point of controversy is about the process for adopting the final constitution. But this compromise over this smaller assembly is basically, over by 28 June, when the Revolutionary Council publishes its rules for the election to the Assembly of Experts. This is a really important part. I'm kind of talking fast to make sure that I can go over a few other points, but what I think is worth paying attention to is that you won't see something so outright authoritarian. You see a referendum, then you see an election to a body to write the constitution. But the point is that the body who has decided the rules for this election to this assembly that is now going to write the constitution is not a neutral body. It's a body that is very much a part of, these forces involved in the revolution, represents only one of them, and is in a situation to come up with the kind of rules that would make sure their side is going to have the majority in the assembly that is to write the constitution. Why? I mean, how they do that? Well, when they publish these rules for the election to the experts assembly, they set the date for the election only 6 weeks from the publication of this. Why is it important? Well, during the Shah regime, all of the secular oppositions, whether leftists or liberals, have basically been, so because of, the atmosphere of Cold War and, some other things, Islamists actually are the forces who have received less of the repressive hand of the monarchy. So it matters the period of 6 weeks because Islamists are in a serious advantage compared to other forces. They are already mobilized through this network of committees, revolutionary committees, mosques, through the judicial network that Khomeini, by appointing judges to this revolutionary court, has created. More important, perhaps, is the fact that the rules for the election define a body that decides that for every 500,000 Iranian, one representative is basically going to that assembly. And then the lines of districts are also gerrymandered to give the rural populations advantage when you have 500,000 people where, and the rural population are, given more representative than the rest, you can pretty much be certain that it's the religious forces who are going to send that one person to the assembly. Not just Khomeini's role, but also the influence of these figures in provinces make sure that in the body that is eventually formed, of the 72, one person, that's another story, but it was from Kurdistan and there's almost a civil war there, but of the 72 that eventually formed that body, 58 of them are clergy. Clearly, this is not, representative of the actual situation. And 80% of this body are members of the 5-month-old Islamic Revolution Party, Islamic Republic Party. Moreover, from this August 3 to August 19, which is the first session of the assembly, you have not only Ayahan, the most important newspaper of the middle classes at the time, but also 22 other newspapers shut down, because at this point you do have all these forces coming together, to have the backlash against the way that the election is basically arranged. And by the time this body finishes its work, 95% of newspapers in country are shut down, and the circulation of the remaining press is cut down to a fifth of what it was when the body started its work. The election, is boycotted by vast, segments of population. Only about 50% of population this time go to the polls. So you have a 50% drop since end of March to beginning of August. And not surprisingly, with such a composition, the experts assembly, which is called experts, and as if the question is whether they are constituent or not, they were very much a constituent assembly in the sense that they were not under any limitation, any external rule. From the very beginning, they realized that they do not have to restrict themselves to the preliminary draft, that they can add it to whatever direction that they want. And so, in fact, in a single session on 12 September, the Assembly votes on Article 5 of the Constitution, which introduces mandate of the jurist, Walayat Faqih, into the Constitution. And I think it's worth mentioning that with only 4 more votes than it needed, so only 53 people in this body vote, they needed 40 now. By October, when it is clear that the constitution that is coming out of this body is something completely different that this body went to its deliberation with, the provisional government basically decides to dissolve the assembly because the assembly has first violated its 1 month time limit for finishing the job. It's been over 3 months, and also because they have not remained faithful to the draft as they were supposed to. But just realizing that the provisional government is considering such a thing, Khomeini stops the plan. I'm not going to go over that because we don't have time. But just about 10 days later, in Bazargan's shaking hand with U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski, the forces close to Khomeini find a pretext to basically stage a coup really against the provisional government. They attack the U.S. Embassy on November 4th. Bazargan government resigns on November 5th. From November 6th to November 15th, just basically in the 10 days after the provisional government resigns, the assembly takes full advantage of the crisis. And if you look at the headlines of newspapers at this time, the country is really worried about the US attack. It's a crisis, it's a national crisis. During these 10 days, the assembly pushes through Article 107 to 110, which are the articles that give the substantive powers of the supreme leader to him. Before that, none of these has been passed, only the one with more general supervisory role. And it's pushed for a referendum just 2 weeks after the body ends its work. And not surprisingly, the democratic hopes, I guess, of the revolutions come to an end after that referendum.
Thank you so much. So we are going to have a 10 minutes break and then we'll come back for Saeed Rahnema and Arato's talk. So thank you so much. We are now going to look into Saeed Rahnema's talk towards a new constitution for you.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, we talked about past constitutions. I'm going to dream of the new constitution. I would like to start by saying that over a century of political struggles in Iran clearly shows that aside from colonial and imperialist interventions, four interrelated problems of despotic rule, centralism, religious intervention, and social inequality have obstructed the attainment of the ideal of democracy. In fact, except for a few short intervals when political chaos had weakened the state, the country lived under authoritarian rule. The capital has been the sole center of political and economic decisions. The Shia clerics have directly or indirectly meddled in the society's social and cultural political life, and the vast majority of people, to different degrees, have been excluded from power and wealth of the nation. On this basis, I believe that any new constitution that does not provide the formal legal basis for the removal of these four obstacles is doomed to repeat and perpetuate this sad history. Thus, a new constitution should have the following main features. Regarding the first question of tyranny and dictatorship, any consideration of monarchy should be discarded. Some of you may wonder why we even bother mentioning this as a possibility. Well, we have got a group of royalists who dream of re-establishing the past order. Therefore, the only option would be a republican system, and also not a presidential republic with strong power for the president, but a parliamentary republic that can prevent the return of dictatorship. There are some Iranian left currents that argue in favor of council-based or councilist republic, which in my opinion, in the current political condition, is neither practical nor even desirable. While I personally believe in the ideal of democratic socialism, I deem its achievement is conditional to the time and situation when the majority of people consciously favor the establishment of a democratic socialist system. Even then, it will not necessarily take the form of council republic, which has got its own problems. As for the problem of centralism, the most suitable solution would be the establishment of a federative system, in which, in addition to the central government, provincial governments whose boundaries will be determined by law will have their own state governments, legislature, and judiciary. In states where national minorities dominate, federalism will be asymmetrical, having more authority in running their own affairs, particularly in relation to the language in administration as much as possible in education. In addition, since Iran has never had experience of such a model of government, federalism at the outset will be relatively more central, gradually moving toward decentralization. In any case, issues of civil rights, secularism, and control of natural resources, water, forests, and wildlife, and strategic industries should remain central. As for the problem of religious interference and lack of secularism, the only obvious solution is pushing religion out of the affair of the state and the educational and judicial systems. To this end, all religious foundations should be dissolved and the charitable programs placed under the control of government and popular institutions. Religious endowments will also be under the control of the government. The Constitution will be clear of any official religion. As for the question of equity and social equality, equality for all citizens, regardless of their gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, ethnicity, race, nationality, and ideological and religious beliefs should be guaranteed. Recognition of differences, rights of political participation and formation of political parties, freedom of opinion, expression, association, free press, and workers and employees' right in decision-making processes should also be guaranteed and safeguarded. Of course, we know that almost all constitutions to different degrees certify these freedoms. Pinochet's constitution also refers to citizen rights, so does North Korean constitution. During the Shah's regime, an American journalist who had visited Iran wrote that if in a public square an Iranian loudly recites some articles of Iran constitution dealing with social freedoms, she or he will be detained by the police. Free and universal education and healthcare also emphasizing the right to work, housing, social insurance, establishment of universal minimum income, along with progressive tax systems and confirmation of different types of ownership regulated by a state should be guaranteed. For me, there should be 5 types of ownership, which is state-owned, private, and also cooperative and communal. Achieving these 4 goals requires a formal legal structure whose main characteristics should be the following: a bicameral legislature, 1, a national assembly whose representatives are elected through proportional representation from constituencies determined by law. I'm aware of the disadvantages of course, this electoral system, but at least allows some smaller, including leftist organizations to get elected. Of course, it will also give chance to very fascistic and right-wing ones. Then the second one is Federal Assembly, consisting of an elected delegates of all provinces, themselves elected from cities and rural areas. Representatives from social groups and movements, women, nationalities, youth, religious minorities, and Iranian diaspora should also have representation in this assembly. The provincial assemblies are directly elected by the people of each province, and in the provinces where non-Fars nationalities predominate, the provincial assembly will have additional authority. As for executive power, there will be a sort of soft 2 executive system, where the president is mainly ceremonial and is elected by the 2 assemblies. The prime minister, who is elected or dismissed by the National Assembly, is the most important figure in the executive branch, who also controls the armed forces. At the provincial level, the governor is elected and dismissed by state assembly. As for the judiciary, consisting of Supreme Court and provincial courts, which operate independent of the 2 branches. The Supreme Court consists of 9 judges who are nominated by the president and approved by the 2 parliaments, and serve for 9 years. All courts are composed of academically educated civil and lay and non-clerical judges. So no mullahs in there. But for me, this is an ideal alternative structure to the present situation in Iran, but the main question is whether it is achievable. It faces definitely many obstacles and problems. It's not clear when and under which conditions and how it will be possible to democratically draft a new constitution. Different scenarios can be envisioned. If, along with brutal suppression of the uprising, and the regime would compromise with the West and its regional foes and remain in power until another round of revolutionary uprising, the present discussion may seem redundant. However, I'm raising these discussions assuming a scenario where the regime is at the verge of total collapse or is overthrown and democratic preparation for a new constitution becomes a possibility. All the contemporary experiences of countries that have promulgated a new constitution, from Greece, Spain, Portugal to South Africa, Iraq, and Nepal, show that new constitution is prepared and approved through negotiations, agreements, and coalitions of different political currents of the opposition. This arrangement contrasts the historical cases where a single political current takes the dominant role, replacing old regime, and writes new constitution, like the Russian October Revolution of 1917 or the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Admittedly, this is a hugely complicated matter, and the main question is how, and in the absence of democracy, the basic law could be prepared democratically. I must say that it's great that in this panel we have under Arato, who is the foremost expert on this, and hopefully we learn from him. And who knows, maybe one day the founding mothers of post-Islamic society would invite you to give consultation in this. Many of the Iranian opposition simply talk of election of Constituent Assembly to draft a new constitution, without paying attention to the fact that preparation of this Constituent Assembly itself has many prerequisites. The experience of other countries have shown that the task itself is a two-stage process that requires the creation of a temporary assembly that determines how to hold the Constituent Assembly and the principles that it should follow. I believe the issue of democratic writing of constitution is far more complicated in the case of Iran today compared to any other country. No doubt the ideal situation would be that representatives or delegates of different social movements and sections of people, nationalities, women, youth, workers, employees, teachers, pensioners, religious minorities, LGBTQ+, artists, political currents, along with legal experts, political scientists, and economists would be present in the initial stage. But how? The first question is, how do these people and political currents and with what weight can join the pre-assembly? One of the big problems relates to the state of Iranian opposition. A good part of Iran opposition are abroad and do not have any organized linkage with the president. The internal opposition is also understandably dispersed, unable to organize, or is in jail. There is no doubt that with the severe weakening of the regime and its downfall, the internal opposition would be in a very different situation, and will produce its own leaders. Already, it has produced its own leaders. I've depicted the present Iran's opposition to in a three-dimensional matrix. I don't know. Do you have it? Yeah. If you could show it, I'll continue while you are putting it. A three-dimensional matrix. We have got left and right, social, religious, and also from moderate to radical. So if
Figure 1 or 2?
both of them, both.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll have to share screen one.
Yeah, if you can.
Sure.
If not, just show the first one very quickly. And
Okay. Good.
okay. The first one, as you see here, you have got the left and right, secular and religious, and also moderate to radical. So this biplot shows almost all the major political organizations in Iran. Now, my argument is that none of these groups actually are in a position to create an alternative or replace the existing regime. And a unified front also is not working. Now, going to the second one, please. If we imagine, okay. If you imagine two circles, the smaller circle is people who are actually not active, but they are against the regime. But the second one, if we look at the extreme, those are all the extreme organizations. In the far secular right, we have got the royalists who want to establish a royal system, with the help of Americans. On the secular left, you have got extreme left organizations who want to establish communist or socialist organizations, establishment of dictatorship of proletariat. On the left religious, you have got the Mujahideen Khalq, which is a large group, probably you know of them, that they are hoping that with the help of Americans, they would bring back their leader who is in sort of occultation now. And then the religious right is the regime itself and also its element of it. So the argument is that none of those people, none of those groups in any of these extremes would cooperate with each other. Actually, they are very much against each other, and it's a situation very similar to the Monty Python, Life of Brian, that they are fighting with each other. So, with having such an opposition, it shows that how weak it is, and they cannot create an alternative. So, the question is that who is going to get into this constitution writing? My argument is that in the absence of a progressive front, the right-wing opposition will have the dominant voice in the formulation of the new constitution. And the four major demands of democratic system discussed earlier would face serious obstacles. Now, as for the type of political system, of course, as I mentioned, the royalists and the right bloc demand a royal system under the pretext of constitutionalism. Some royalists compare themselves to Spain after Franco. This reminds me of the 1988 US vice presidential debate when the not so intelligent Republican candidate Dan Quayle compared himself to Jack Kennedy. And the Democratic candidate said that, I know Jack Kennedy, I've worked with Jack Kennedy, you are no Jack Kennedy. So, and I think I can say to the royalists, you know. So, as for the question of centralism and the need for federalism, we already know that the right-wing bloc, by creating a fuss about territorial integrity and falsely accusing all national minorities, of having separatist tendencies, vigorously oppose a federative system. As for secularism, even though broad range of political currents from left and right and secular religious groups support this goal, its full inclusion in the law will not be as easy as some imagine. Regardless of what happens, many Ayatollahs and their followers will remain in society. Even in two of the most important bases of the current situation in Kurdistan and Baluchistan, clerics actually have a very strong presence, and they will have such a presence. In the absence of a very strong secular bloc, the basic demand of movement will face serious opposition. And it is possible that, like Iraqi constitution, by playing with the words confirmation of non-interference of religion in government affairs, Islam would be declared as the official religion of and the basis for legislation. I mean, Arato knows it very well. The difference between the reactionary and the progressive blocs are even more pronounced on the question of social justice and equity, and on economic and environmental demands. The right-wing bloc, of course, has got its own class interests in mind, and with the support of plentiful neoliberal economists, liberal lawyers, and right-wing political scientists emphasize economic growth, privatization, opposes social safety net, and trade unions, etc., etc. On the other hand, we have the extreme demand of some of the very radical left currents, who, regardless of the real economic condition, demand their ideal system of immediate establishment of socialist system, socialization of means of production, workers' control, councilism, and direct democracy. Aside from these, there is a major issue of justice for victims of incredible crimes committed by the Islamic regime. Here also we face with two extremes. One side simply stresses the South African forgive but not forget, and the other, in the words of a radical left organization, dissolution of a state, army, and all religious organizations, and detention of all state, military, and religious officials, and confiscation of all of their properties. Here also we have the experience of Iraq, and we know the dangers involved in doing such a thing that we need to remember. How these serious differences of opinion can end up in some kind of agreement and compromise is a very complicated question. And unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic about it, especially that we haven't had any democratic experience to rely on. In case of unresolved differences among oppositions to have a two-stage process, I was thinking that probably a sort of plan B, following what the Greeks did in the aftermath of the collapse of the colonies in 1974. For the first stage, they temporarily reinstated the old 1952 constitution, removing all references to the king and conferred those authorities to the president. If we resort to this temporary solution, we need to remove not only the references to the Shah, but also to the clerics and the Sharia. In that case, I looked over 42 articles of the Mashruta constitution, and its amendments must be removed. Of course, Jeanette, Professor Afary would be a better authority to comment on this. On this basis, for the transition period, an election for the temporary majlis can be held under the UN inspection, and rules of election for Constituent Assembly, Provisional Constitutional Court, and provisional government are set, and arrangements are made to move to the second stage of drafting the Constitution and its approval. Having said all this, my greatest hope rests on the young women and young men inside Iran who started the Women Life Freedom uprising, and on the new generation of the left who, unlike our generation, thinks freely and is not doctrinaire. The progressive, secular, democratic left opposition in diaspora can play a supporting role and strengthen its popular base inside Iran. The past leaders must learn to become today's followers. Thank you. I'm sorry, I've been very tired, you know. I mean, I've been traveling from Europe to here, so I'm sort of not concentrating.
Thank you so much. Now we are going to listen to Andrew Arato. His title is From Revolution to Democracy or to Another Revolution.
Well, you know, of course, I'm under the influence of everything I heard here, so I'm not sure if I stick to the original plan, which was going to be given introduction that I probably know less about Iran than anybody in this room. And the only things that I do know about Iran are because I have such wonderful students who have taught me, starting with the Sadri twins, by the way. I don't even know if you know them. A long time ago, the Sadri twins with Rezvana Ganji and Bahareh. And now I even have newer ones who are teaching me things. But really, even about Iraq, I just wrote a book because I was so angry about the American invasion and how they were really producing a mess in a place where perhaps better opportunities, better possibilities also existed, although I'm not that sure of that now. But in any case, what I was going to talk about was really the process, and from a comparative point of view, and I think my job is made both easier and harder. My very, very interesting talk of Professor Rahnema, harder because he anticipated many of the things that I would talk about, but of course also easier because it means that I can perhaps focus on theoretical matters, which are the things that I'm competent to talk about. As I said, Iran really, I mean, in order to talk about Iran reasonably now, the present, one would have to be able to measure and understand the level of protest, which somehow seems to be reviving periodically, but at no particular point does it become powerful enough, or even with extensive enough support to actually transform the system in any radical ways. One would have to somehow figure out whether this is permanent or whether the next round will be different. What Professor Rahnema said about women and the young is reason to be encouraged, but still I'm not the person to assess that. And the second thing we have to know about, and he has not stressed this so much, but I'm sure he agrees, is the level at which the existing institutions and the existing centers of power themselves are split or divided or in conflict, internal conflicts of various kinds. Because I think you can probably see that in those cases where there has been a transition to some kind of democracy without foreign invasion and defeat in a foreign war, without the role of an international movement and organization, which, for example, even in the Russian Revolution, certainly its role cannot be underestimated. And so I think we have to see that in all major cases there are these splits, and these splits exist. As Afary, I know I'm learning this really from you and you and others. It is even within the Islamic elite itself, that is within the religious elite, there are fundamental splits and divisions over religion itself and over the relationship of religion to the state. So one would think that this would be an area which we would have to pay some attention to. And I think that brings me to what I actually wanted to say, which is a little bit of a repeat of what was done just before me, but perhaps it will add a new element, namely the modality of change. I think you all know that in the world left, but primarily Western left, there's a really long-standing debate between advocates of reform and advocates of revolution, right? I mean, this is really, in terms of almost every European country, an old matter, goes back really to even Marx and Engels' lifetimes, but certainly after that, this debate becomes extremely interesting, and strong arguments are made on both sides. I mean, I say Edward Bernstein on one side, Rosa Luxemburg on the other side, are the major figures you all know, of course, who they are. And I think they all made some very powerful points. And what are these points? I think that's what is going to be perhaps applicable even here. Revolution creates a political, this is Bernstein's perspective, a political vacuum, a political form of disorganization where it is extremely unpredictable and very difficult to figure out who is actually going to be able to put it all together again. We now know after the work of the Russian Bolsheviks, and then scholars like Teda Skocpol, that the outcome of that tends to be very much state and central state strengthening. That is, the revolutionary chaos and the strengthening of an authoritarian statist outcome go together. Bernstein wasn't so clear about this, but I think that he feared revolution and advocated an alternative idea instead. Rosa Luxemburg, on the other hand, and this is also, of course, a critique is made by Lenin and Trotsky and others, is that the reformist thing will live too much in place. In other words, reform can, of course, change certain things, but it will help consolidate the main components of the existing system. And so reformism is to be rejected, and a revolutionary alternative must be found. Both of these arguments have a lot of historical evidence to justify them or to support them. The history of revolutions is very few exception, a history of authoritarian regime, authoritarian outcomes. In this particular case, we see a dramatic example of that, but it is by no means the only one. And the history of reform, let us say, in capitalist societies, is that capitalism always survives reform. In no setting has one ever been able to reform capitalism out of existence. So authoritarian outcomes, and at the same time, too much of the old survives, even as things change. And of course, this doesn't mean that in both revolutions and in reforms, there are not important steps toward human progress, important developments. Obviously, important things have been achieved in both kinds of settings. But I think the critiques, nevertheless, remain right. So what I was going to suggest, and you already alluded to this with respect to my work, is that it was a very important breakthrough in the history of radical change, or even the idea of radical change, that a new method has been invented, that a new possible methodology has emerged, and this I think is the work of activists and intellectuals in lots of countries. I would say perhaps Spain being first, South Africa being last, and many other countries in between. And this, of course, is not a utopia in itself either, because we now see, let's say, the two countries that I have spent most of my time working on, and of course I'm from one of them, Hungary and Poland, is that in the end, even the negotiated transition leads to deformation, or can be exploited by those who wish to deform it. But the South African case proves to some extent the contrary. There too have been serious attempts to turn the transformation in authoritarian direction, and they failed. They were defeated. So in some ways, it remains an open question whether this particular methodology can both lead to more radical outcomes than reform. Say the South African case surely does not indicate that the apartheid system in any fundamental respect survived. So in that sense, the outcome is radical. And on the other side, avoid the dangers, the looming threat of revolution. And I think now, without pretending that I know what I'm talking about, still I would like to, in some ways, ask whether this third option is possible in Iran. Reform has been around, so that is not a new option. in the Iranian case. And of course, I think people here who know Iran well will point out, yes, there was Khatami's reform, there were other reform attempts, significant dimensions of the legal system, which is what Bahareh studies, have indeed been changed in a more rational direction. Nevertheless, the regime stays. And there are certain moments where it's even re-radicalized. So there's a kind of cyclical reform leads to a kind of cyclical development, which does not mean which means that that even its achievements are not safe. One could even apply this to the reform of capitalism in the social democratic countries, because there has been real turn in directions that have compromised many of the social democratic welfare state kind of achievements, even in those settings. So I think the issue is whether the issue is not whether a purely reformist option should be proposed in Iran. And I think I'm not sure if many of you will agree with this, but nevertheless, I will say it. I am not optimistic about a future Iranian revolution either. I'm not optimistic about a purely reform process from above, and I'm not optimistic about what will happen. Of course, we could be wrong, and we would hope that that I'm now wrong in what I'm saying. But if the Islamic regime is brought down in a radical way, creating a fundamental vacuum of power, whether this would actually lead to a democratic outcome in any sense is something at least to consider. Now, I don't know if the people in the street are revolutionaries. I don't know if they see themselves as revolutionaries. I don't think they see themselves as reformists either. They certainly see themselves as making radical demands, but radical demands in themselves cannot be realized, so it requires political strategy. So what would that strategy be? So just as a hypothesis, I will say the strategy would be to aim at some kind of negotiated solution. That was your proposal too, but then you described a political picture in which it's very, very difficult to imagine that all these groups on your complicated diagram could actually come together in a process which would yield at least a single converging set of outcomes. So I'm going to put my neck out and say, don't abandon reformism too quickly. In order for any negotiated solution to work, you need actors on both sides. In order for a negotiated solution to work, it's not enough that we organize ourselves, which is hopefully going to be possible in Iran beyond the fragmentation you just described. But even then, a negotiated solution requires two partners. And so my hope would be that the internal tensions within the governing organization, whether that is the clerical elite, whether there is a revolutionary guard, whether that is the military or the state bureaucracy, will develop fissures sufficient to underwrite some kind of reformist experiment. And I don't think that reformist experiment, to make myself clear, I don't think that should be trusted to produce an outcome beyond the current regime. We were talking about constitution, a new constitution. And that has been Mousavi, I guess, right? Is the person who introduced the topic into the Iranian discussions, a need for a new constitution. But the fundamental question is, who is to accomplish it? If it is accomplished entirely from above, the elements of survival of the current regime, as in the case of all reforms, would again be a fundamental threat. So if a new constitution, then you need a new context within that new constitution could be negotiated. Certainly, since I wrote about it, I think it should be a two-step process. And not the idea of going immediately to an election, producing a national constituent assembly. Who will control it? Well, the most powerful political force would control it. That's the way it tends to work. And if it can't control it, think of Lenin, they will get rid of it. So I think a two-stage process is right. But in order for that two-stage process to work, initially, you need reformers on the other side. And so even though I'm pretty sure that at the moment on the streets of Tehran and other Iranian cities, the reformers, the reputation of the reformers is low, and the credit reformers would get from the street or from the activists, I think that attitude should be revised to whatever extent possible, and it should be in the end. I think the chances for a better future would depend on these two dimensions coming together: mobilization. And by the way, I don't think that there will be serious reformers without that mobilization. So the mobilization is all important, but it is not enough on its own. And I think in some sense, a dual process, in part from above and in part from below, would be, I think, the most would create the greatest chance for getting to the first stage, if you want, of a possible transformation. I mean, no one, I think, should doubt that the current constitution of Iran should be radically replaced. I mean, the idea that this constitution, and we should probably study it, and Bahareh is an excellent expert who has pointed out to me that it's not only the 79 Constitution, but it's 89 transformation, which really created a kind of authoritarian constitution par excellence, and it's still there. It is still there. So on that level, there's no question that the Constitution should be replaced, and I certainly think that the model you have depicted, which sounds to me very much like the German federal constitution, but doesn't matter. As you said, as it was said before, in previous experiments, there has been learning from country to country, and why not the German Federal Republic's constitution or something like it? But in any case, that just because we can generate a model like that does not mean that we know what kind of process would be the most likely to lead to it. Obviously, we cannot repeat, and no one should suggest we should repeat the way the Germans got to it, which was through foreign conquest, a defeat in a war. And so it's not, no one should give much credit to those who think that it would be through international pressure or through foreign intervention of any kind that one can reach the result. But that means that Iranians have to do it themselves. And I think that the model of achieving it entirely from above, which is probably what Mousavi was thinking, or the model of generating it from entirely from below, should be improved in this sense of a double process in which reform from above and in which pressure from below somehow come together. Maybe Gorbachev is not a bad model for this. Iran needs perhaps a Gorbachev. Maybe if this gentleman decides to die relatively quickly, maybe in that case one could imagine, after all, a supreme leader is less bound than anybody else, and perhaps that would be one of the ways of getting to the model that I'm suggesting. But it shouldn't be trusted. It shouldn't be trusted, and I think the mobilization from below is a sign, at least, that it can be done. And I very much hope that it will be done in my lifetime. I've seen the Islamic Revolution. I'm old enough to remember this whole story and almost every stage in it. I'd love to see it end, that particular episode, and perhaps it will.
Thank you so much. If anyone has questions.
Yep. Sorry. Just give a second for the mobile mic to turn on. There we go. Great. Yes, so for folks in the room, if you have questions, if you just want to raise your hand, and we'll come around to you and get the mic. For folks who are on Zoom, if you want to type stack into the chat, and then we'll come to you presently.
Thank you for those really interesting talks. When people talk about Iran, it seems to me like there's an often implied question, which is why can't Iran just be normal? It's like the aspiration to become a normal country, like to be like a normal functioning secular democracy. And obviously that framing is problematic in a few different ways. Bahareh kind of pointed out like this focus on the inexplicable singularity and how that framing is problematic. But there's another aspect of it that I want to ask you guys about, which is like that normal countries, so in quote unquote, right, are in really bad shape right now. Like democracy is barely functioning. Masses of people are disengaged from official politics. Mass protests, when they do happen, often are ignored and fail to secure lasting change. And all this is happening in the face of like a looming climate apocalypse. So there's like a funny thing, which is like about, and this bears on the question of reform and revolution as well, which is if the prospects for Iran's transformation into a functioning secular democracy seem, if there's reason to be pessimistic about that, which I agree, it doesn't look so promising in the short term. But it seems to me that in that condition, then, isn't there a potential for thinking of the future in some other way? Like, isn't there a risk that in trying to be pragmatic, in trying to be hard-headed and paying attention to the facts on the ground, that in a weird way we sort of fail to be realistic? Because, and I'm going to do it, I'm going to quote Lenin, we have to be as radical as reality itself.
Who is that question directed to?
Everybody.
Okay.
Anybody who would like to say something about it.
I mean, the question of reform and revolution also, I would like to respond to aspects of that Professor Arato mentioned. I think in the matrix that I showed, all those groups who fall inside the circle, which includes liberals, left, and also we have some religious secular people. We have strong religious secular elements in Iran. The coalition of these groups would have the possibility of not only confronting the regime itself, but also the very radical right wing, which is threatening again another round of failure for us. Reformism, no doubt, should be distinguished between as opposed to revolution, and also reformism as opposed to the Iranian so-called reformists. The Iranian reformists within the regime have proven that they have been an integral part of the system. They never wanted to depart from it. Right. And so I don't see any possibility that they would be doing anything against this regime. But it happens that when revolutionary movements starts and goes ahead, no doubt part of the regime collapses, So, and those can be attracted to this. And here, of course, is that you should welcome this, you know. I mean, there are groups that, as of now, they said that we should detain everybody, you know, you guys have the regime. So this is going to create problem. I think there is this possibility, provided we have enough really efforts that all these three groups that I mentioned would come together. Because inside Iran, the situation is very different from outside. Inside Iran, we see that the regime is in serious problem. No doubt, no revolution can happen without external support. I have studied revolutions. I don't know any single revolution which has not happened as a result of something outside that country. From French Revolution in 1848, the Paris Commune, to others, all it has been the Russian Revolution, German Revolution. So I think for Iran, for the time being, this external element is absent, you know, because neither Americans nor Europeans nor the Islamic foes in the region wants the collapse of the Islamic regime. They want to reform it. They want to stay in power because because Americans have got another problem. They are now in Ukraine, but their focus is on China, not in the Middle East and many other aspects. I think there are possibilities. There are, while I'm still pessimistic, but I think there are possibilities that inside Iran, you know, would take advantage of the crisis of the Islamic regime, and support from outside could move toward a better situation. But we cannot count on the reformists of the regime, and I don't see any Gorbachev, even if I consider Gorbachev as a positive figure.
Would you like to respond to that question?
I think it's somehow related to that, you know.
Okay.
The question was general, you know, so I had to.
I can. I don't think you're going to like my answer, but I'm not sure if what you mentioned, if those could be understood as problems arising from democracy, or if they can be better framed as a deficiency of democracy in certain spheres. So, for example, if elections in America are very much dominated by these, lobbyists, or money that basically comes to the process, or environment. I don't think these are problems that are caused by democracy. I still think that democracies are best hope. We can just think about how we can think of democratic systems in more democratic ways. But since I started talking, I also want to raise a question for Saeed, actually. I don't think anybody would really think of necessarily Rouhani as a reformist, but still, given the forces that we have, he was apparently just a couple of months ago in the, this experts assembly that I'm not talking about is not that expert assembly. This is, the assembly that would choose the next leader. There were some movements in that assembly, for example, to, and you kind of mentioned it, who would be the person that opposition would be willing at some point to enter negotiation with, would be determined perhaps by how the situation unfolds later, under pressure. But I think part of maybe the solution is to actually shift from the sort of situation that right now people would think that someone like Rouhani, we would rather, work with, who to say than him, that perhaps part of the problem has to be addressed by addressing exactly that question, that we gotta live with millions of people who are supporters of Islamic Republic. We gotta live with millions of people who in some way, if not work directly for the Revolutionary Guard, are in some way making their money through the economic network. That And I think it's not that we are going to get the negotiating partner that we wish to have, but we kind of need to look at who's out there and still who might be someone that you can think of achieving your second best, not the first necessarily, but changing, one of the problems of the 79 revolution to me is that anything that was almost touched by the Shah regime had become, najis, untouchable, and that mentality, I think to move from that mentality that, something has been contaminated by, the regime. So the reformists, basically worked for the survival of the regime, kind of pushing against that, I think is perhaps our only hope.
I may have given a kind of misleading impression with this Gorbachev analogy. Something like Gorbachev doesn't pop out of nothing. In the period of Stalin, or even in the 50s after his death, the Gorbachev phenomenon would have been impossible. It took a lot of reforms for that to be possible. But those reforms were not radical reforms of the structure. The Khomeini economy was not fundamentally abolished. In some countries, it was supplemented with some elements of the market, but still, the reforms were very small scale in the order of things. But one thing they did allow, and this is true even in the Soviet Union, is the emergence of some kind of oppositional activity which allowed oppositionists to communicate. I mean, it's not a huge thing in itself, right? That you are not immediately repressed for talking to your friends, and yet that spreads. And so I think that the reason why I would be very happy if there would be a so-called reformist leadership emerging in her, either through the presidency, which is not impossible, probably, right? Or to the change of the supreme leader, which is given his age also not impossible, right? Some kind of reformist project which in a way detotalizes the society in some significant way. Then the possibility of the kind of protest that you now see to become broader, to get more support. People join such a thing when it feels a little bit safer. And for them to join it when it is so dangerous as it is right now, I mean, you all follow the news because the group here is interested in it, right? It is extremely dangerous for anybody at the present moment to participate in these pretty visible actions, right? Because arrest then can mean torture, imprisonment, and even death. How many people have died? Probably a couple of hundred already in the repressive phase of this movement. So, to me, the first phase of a reformist process would be the removal of fear to a significant extent, so that people actually can act. The popular actor emerges in most cases if the fear is gone. But if the fear is there and the repression is of a very, very high level, then I think it takes heroism. I think everybody who you see on the streets is a hero, right? We see heroes, and as Brecht said beautifully, right? I think you might remember, unlucky the country that needs heroes, right? In the sense that if only heroes can save us, we will never be saved, right? And so reformism means that it doesn't require heroism to act. That would be the first step. Now, if I'm making a stage model like this, then I'm predicting that I'm not going to live to see the result. But logic sometimes leads you to a conclusion which is not perhaps the most, because we would like the result to be fast, right? I think this is, pretty clear that a radical and thorough change of the Islamic Republic would be something that, what we're in this room because we believe in that. But perhaps it takes some smaller steps first. Just very, very briefly, I said that I really do not believe that Rouhani was a different person from. I mean, if you of course compare it to Ahmadinejad, you may some differences, but categorically they belong to the same group. Rouhani administration was as corrupt as this one, extremely corrupt, and Rouhani himself fooled many of the people, pretending that he is a reformer. He didn't do any reform, and I don't think he would be considered even as part of it. If so far as the regime continues to suppress and get the support from outside, it will not make any changes. But when the forces of change move toward it, taking advantage of the crisis, and eventually the regime becomes weak, then you will see that the system is collapsing, and then some people from this regime will come up. Even now, Mousavi is a much better example, who has been bold enough after 10 years in jail, I'm not a supporter, but I said that at least he's a better example than Rouhani.
But
Rouhani is a
Mousavi-
fraud.
I have no personal attachment to Rouhani, absolutely. But what I'm trying to say is that Mousavi is not in any part of the government. He is, as you said, he's under house arrest. Rouhani, after his presidency, I'm talking about what he was trying to do in the Majlis of Khobregan. And I'm not, insisting on him at all. I'm just saying that we may even have to be okay with people that we find fundamentally different, but I wouldn't go as far as you went to say that Rouhani there's no difference between him and, let's say, the supreme leader. The whole nuclear deal was, one thing that shows the differences between the outlooks
He's
of
more
different
pragmatic,
factions.
but he's not a reformer.
I'm not saying that he has any internal attachment to democracy even at all, but that at the end, you should probably.
Yeah, I think we have Professor, if you'd like to chime in off of Zoom really quickly, and then we just have a couple of more questions. I see a couple of questions in the stack, and then we have one question in the room. So if at all possible, given that we are going to be going a little over time here, if folks can try to keep their comments as concise as possible. I understand it's not easy. But...
So I'm not quite sure the division that my very good friend Saeed Rahnema made. That would have been something quite true 40 years ago. But I mean, yes, there are some extreme people on the left, but, I know these leftists like Arato. I was around. I've seen these people. I've seen how they've changed. So even some of the worst leftists of that time, today, they're, far more shameful about what they did. They're open. I mean, Heidi Morisi wrote a wonderful book. We really haven't had a chance to talk about women's issues here. But a lot of people are admitting in the left that they were completely wrong on gender issues, for example. And I see a lot among the reformists. Yes, I do criticize them for not really making a clean break. But I think the reason might be what Bahareh is saying. But I do see them talking about gender issues and environmental issues. So I'm not quite sure the situation is as stark as we see. Having said that, I'm actually intrigued by what Saeed Rahnema said about seeing if there would be some sort of going back, he said, to the 1906 Constitution, but I would even say the 1979 Constitution, it's really two documents, as Bahareh was saying. In other words, there's this one part of it that's rather progressive and it's like a normal constitution. And then there are all these things that are tacked to it. So yeah, I think it's an exercise in terms of seeing what people think out there. It might not be such a bad idea to go through these documents and just basically take them out, and I guess you could do that also for the 1906-7 Constitution, leave it out there and see if people are agreeing that that will be maybe the common denomination on which they're willing to come together. Thank you.
Yeah, only as you know, I just referred to the Greek example that what they did since they could not agree, they said that, oh, how about we use the 1952 Constitution, not forever, but also for
Right, as a preliminary stage. Yes, I understand. Right, right.
So I
Yes.
think that's part of it. And as for the left, of course, definitely, you know, we have the wide spectrum of the left. It's not like only during the revolution. Now we have got actually a large number of left have left the left. You know,
Right, and the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore.
yes,
either.
so it does. And so we have now on one extreme, we have got the sort of extreme left, which wants immediate transfer to a communist society or socialist society, although there are very small groups, but this
Very
is how,
small group. That's what I'm trying to say.
but
Right.
all groups are small now, you know.
Yeah, but the fact that
they're
every leftist feels that they should include a language about LGBTQ
Yeah.
and environment, that means that they can't be, and that, you know, that they understand the importance of gender. I think, you know, they're a different generation. We shouldn't compare them with, you know, basically the generation of the revolution.
Okay, but what I refer is that they are not different generation. I'm talking all of these are continuation. Most of these organizations that I mentioned actually are remnants of the revolution. Unfortunately, none of them could attract the young people. So the new left in Iran, is very different from them. They are not part of this. So whatever we have in these organizations, these are actually my generation from
Right.
1979 revolution, the left during that time. Some have remained radical, some have moderated, some have become completely anti-socialist. I call them enzejariyun amiyun instead of, you know, ijtimaiyun amiyun.
Right. So, yeah, I sort of have hope for the new generation, and I think both among the religious reformers, I would say, you know, even though that's not my own position, but I think among the religious reformers and among the environmentalist leftists and among the nationalists who would like to make a clean break with monarchy, that I could see a coalition building there.
Thank you, Professor. And we got, I think, two more in the room on Stack and then one on Zoom. Oh, Arya has passed. Okay, but I think that there was Sarah who had a Stack in the Zoom. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pass the mic to the two folks in the room to ask their questions back to back, and then have panelists respond. And just so everybody knows, we only have a room for about 10 more minutes, so we're working on a slightly tight time schedule here.
I had two questions. The second was perhaps asking about the certain hybrid system that is neither reform or revolution, but I'll leave that question aside. The other question I think is an observation that perhaps surpasses Professor Arato's lack of optimism to full pessimism for the current situation in Iran. And I think in looking at it and in some of the looks towards sort of the history of the past, and I think now I'm referring to the history of the present, what I hear not so much about is the material forces within these conditions that, as you mentioned, are ultimately the things that make the decision as for who writes the Constitution and what parts of it will actually be executed and actually be taken seriously and so on. And in looking at that, I think the current situation, as I see it in my full pessimism, is that, you know, I guess we can call it the bourgeoisie in Iran that kind of got fat during the privatization efforts, as it did in places like Vietnam, even Venezuela, and so on. is now demanding its sort of full and open control of the political system at the moment. And it's aligned with the international bourgeoisie, it's aligned with geopolitical.
Just shorten your.
Sure, yeah, last, and so on. In doing so, I think it's happy to use real struggles of different, let's say, identity groups to legitimize its demand to be able to mobilize people and weaponize them to change the regime, or at least the part of the regime, which is the Islamist group, that could do things against its benefits. I think that's my view of what's happening in Iran, and I understand that it's somewhat dark, but I'd like to be proven wrong. I've come for a cure for my pessimism.
Thank you. Question for Dr. Rahnema. I'm really interested to learn more about the diagram that you showed and the central part that you highlighted in there. Can you explain a bit more how are you envisioning layering in the federal structure that you talked about and bringing in the ethnic minority like Kurds and Turks and even like maybe queers, like they don't really exist in that central structure right now within the system. How can they be representative even in that central part in your envisioning?
Well, I mean, you wanted to explain the matrix or?
No, like the overlap between the federal structure where we are going to have the Kurds, Turks within this central part, because they've been excluded for years.
Yes,
and
no,
they're not
that's
really
okay.
in the middle. Yeah.
You know, actually, what I did, because usually those people who believe in federative system, they just keep on saying federalism for Iran without going into the details. Actually, I tried to go into more details. Of course, part of it I mentioned here, that you have a bicameral system. The national, you know, that with new boundaries, you know, I mean, they have created lots of ostans, lots of provinces. They've cut through Kurds, you know, intentionally, you know, as you all know. So there should be a different one based on the criteria that part of it would be the type of nationalities, languages which are there, you know, in terms of the Turks, the Kurds, the Baluchis, and Arabs, and other elements. So one way of representation is just they come to the National Assembly. But the more important one is the second, I call it in Farsi, Majlis Ijma, which brings representations from all these ostans, how they are created from villages, wards in the cities, representatives go to the cities, or then the cities go to ostans, and they come to the national parliament. So this is a very strong representation by them. Aside from it, they will also have their own regional representation, the regional provincial government, legislature, and judiciary, and everything. So it's quite strong in terms of that problem. In terms of women, LGBTQ, and other, and even diaspora, I suggest that they should have representation. I took it from different constitutions, as you mentioned, from German, French, you know, there are some very good examples that you can pick from other constitutions. I think this way they will have a strong representation in three levels, two national parliament and also one regional.
And to add his question, if anyone has an answer. That question.
Oh, okay, I mean, the first part that you mentioned that it's neither reform or revolution, I quite agree with you. I mean, we have, I believe in radical reform, you know, which is a combination, taking that while it is pragmatic and progressive, but at the same time it's radical. You know, I've written about it that I glad to send in the articles.
But maybe I will reformulate this question. I think with the experience of South Africa specifically, that these two processes of political reforms and economic reform, transition, were separated. The outcome was really a disaster as we are seeing it now. I read somewhere that when Mandela was leaving power, the life expectancy had decreased by 13 years for Black people in South Africa. Given the current situation in Iran, that you have like this latest round of privatizations, it's very intense. So any transition would, for that, we would need to think about what we are going to do with these problems. Are we going to confiscate the properties? And if that's the case, what would be their motivation to get into negotiations with opposition? Is that a good reformulation?
My question was more about the fact that, as I see it, the forces that will actually be able to have agency after any change in the central government are the forces that are actually already formed within the government. They may start wearing ties tomorrow, but they're pretty much the same.
Yeah.
And they're aligned with the old bourgeoisie, the monarchists now, they're aligned with geopolitical interests of the empire and so on. So I think my concern is that they are going to have the power, no matter how many good things we say about sort of identity groups and human rights and so on.
You know, two aspects. One on the South African one, you know, or any other example. Here, at least I focus on formal legal aspect, on the structure. But in order to have a democratic system, there are cultural, political, lots of the content of it is very different. What in South Africa, the second one did not happen, you know, because of all the problems that we can get. So as for the calling the bourgeoisie of Iran, you know, I have a problem with it, because although there is a bourgeoisie of Iran, but the main bourgeoisie of Iran are those who are linked with the government. Independent bourgeoisie, in a sense, is non-existent because they cannot operate unless they have linkages with the Sepah Pastaran, and unless they have linkages with all the regime. So no doubt they have their interest that we would not move toward a revolution, you know, no doubt about it. Many of you see, if we go back to the earlier stages of the revolution, you had more radicals among these Islamists. They really wanted to establish the state of Mustazafin, the oppressed, you know, the depressed, you know. But gradually, they, instead of waiting for heaven, they discovered heaven in northern Tehran, you know, and in other cities. And they didn't have how to live, so they themselves became bourgeois, you know. But that bourgeoisie is different from the bourgeoisie that you have in the US and in capitalist countries, you know, because they are totally dependent on it. You know, we have banks, you know, that cannot operate without having the relationship with the Sepah Pastaran. No doubt about it. So I think we have to make this distinction. I really do not see independent bourgeois movements, you know, in this.
short, quick comment. I think any bourgeoisie after neoliberalism is not independent. It's a financial bourgeoisie, and in
That's
effect,
true, yeah.
it's always connected, but I think you're
the-
discounting the metamorphosis. of
Let's
that.
have that discussion outside.
Sure,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
sorry.
Great. All right. So we are at our time. Please give another round of applause for our panel. Thank you, everybody, for coming to Society and Justice Workshop. We are having another event on May 16th.
I gotta really
At
run.
4:15 p.m. And with Professor Michael Afary will be reading a new chapter of his book. Workshop in the Political Science Department. Thanks so much. Have a good night.